Alice Martins was late, again. It was a feeling she knew all too well, but today it felt different. This was the day that could change everything, the day she had been preparing for, praying for. Today's interview at Scott Enterprises could mean financial freedom. It could mean paying off her overdue bills, catching up with rent, and securing the future of her mother's medical care. Alice couldn't afford to mess this up. Her heart pounded in her chest as she weaved through the crowded city streets. She gripped her coffee cup in one hand, the warm liquid sloshing dangerously near the edge, and tried to unlock her phone with the other, tapping it with her thumb to check the time. She cursed under her breath when the screen didn't respond. She was supposed to have left 30 minutes ago, and now she was racing against time. The Scott Enterprises building loomed ahead, tall and gleaming in the sunlight, an epitome of success and power. The logo was huge, unmistakable, and Alice could almost feel it mocking her, reminding her of everything she hadn't yet accomplished. Please, just let me make it there on time. She felt the weight of her overdue bills pressing on her chest, a constant reminder that this was her last chance. If she didn't nail this interview, she'd be back to square one, struggling for a paycheck that barely covered the basics. Her feet pounded the pavement faster, dodging pedestrians and taxis that honked as they sped by. She couldn't remember a time when she hadn't been late for something important, but today felt different. There was too much riding on this. Focus, Alice, focus. Her phone buzzed again, and for a brief moment, she glanced down to see a text from her younger sister, Lena, "Mom's getting worse." Alice's stomach dropped, her heart sinking at the words. Her mother had been fighting an illness for months, and the medical bills were piling up faster than she could handle. The pressure of it all felt suffocating, but she couldn't afford to get distracted. She didn't have the luxury to be emotional right now. After the interview, I'll call her. Alice's pace quickened as she approached the Scott Enterprises entrance, but then disaster struck. Without warning, she collided with something, or rather someone. It wasn't just someone, it was a brick wall in a suit. The impact was so sudden that her coffee cup flew out of her hand, sending the contents soaring through the air. Time seemed to slow, and Alice watched helplessly as the brown liquid sailed toward its target. She could see the droplets midair as they landed directly on the man's chest. A collective gasp sounded around her, but the gasp she heard was not hers. Alice stood there, frozen, staring up at the man she had just drenched. He was tall, far taller than her, broad-shouldered, with dark, perfectly styled hair. His suit was expensive, tailored to perfection, and now ruined. His face was striking, his features sharp, chiseled almost like someone you'd see in a magazine. But it was his expression that stopped her breath. He stared down at the coffee stain on his shirt, eyes narrowing as his jaw clenched, like he was holding back a storm of frustration. For a moment, Alice couldn't breathe. She was sure she was going to faint from embarrassment. She opened her mouth to apologize, but nothing came out. The man glanced up at her, his eyes hard, cold. "Really?" he asked, his voice calm but dripping with irritation. His tone was sharp, like a blade slicing through the air. I am so sorry," Alice stammered, desperately trying to salvage the situation. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she wished more than anything that she could just disappear into the ground. The man's gaze flickered to the coffee stain on his shirt again before meeting her eyes. "You do realize this suit costs more than your rent, right?" Alice felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth, trying to find words, but nothing came. She was already drowning in her own humiliation. She was already late for the most important interview of her life, and now she'd spilled coffee on this man who looked like he owned half the city. "I didn't," she began, but he cut her off, raising his hand. "Next time," he said, stepping back, "try not to walk into strangers, especially when they're in your way." Alice blinked, completely stunned. She had no idea how to respond to such a comment. Was this how people like him spoke, so coldly, so detached? As the moment stretched on, she began to feel the full weight of her clumsy mistake. This was the worst thing that could have happened. "Maybe," Alice muttered, trying to recover her wits, "maybe it was the coffee's fault. You know, these cups are super slippery, and I've heard baristas sometimes use defective lids." The man paused for a split second before looking at her with a raised eyebrow. "Interesting theory," he replied flatly. "Thanks, but I don't need to hear the rest." She winced. "God, I sound like an idiot." His lips tightened into a thin line and he sighed, rubbing his face in frustration. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, turning away from her. Next time, try not to turn strangers into modern art." With that, he walked into the building, his back straight and imposing. Alice watched him go, still rooted to the spot, feeling like she had just made the biggest fool of herself. Great, first disaster of the day. As if on autopilot, Alice turned around and rushed into the Scott Enterprises lobby, her heart still racing. She kept thinking about how the coffee had stained the man's suit and how ridiculous she must have looked. She nearly bumped into a few people in the lobby but apologized quickly, muttering an apology under her breath. "This interview is all that matters," she repeated to herself like a mantra. "Get it together, Alice." The receptionist greeted her politely and informed her that Mr. Scott was expecting her. She followed the directions to the designated floor, still feeling her nerves jangling in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't believe the embarrassing first encounter she had just had with the CEO of the company she was about to interview for, but there was no turning back now. When Alice reached the conference room, she took a deep breath, her hand trembling slightly as she knocked on the door. The door opened, and Alice stepped inside, only to freeze in her tracks. Sitting behind a large desk, looking down at a file, was none other than David Scott, the man she had just drenched with coffee. He looked up, his piercing gray eyes locking with hers. Alice felt her stomach flip. The same man, the one she had just humiliated. David Scott, the CEO of Scott Enterprises, the man she had spilled coffee on not 20 minutes ago, the man who was now looking at her with the same cold, calculating gaze. Alice's breath caught in her throat. "You're here for the secretary position," David said, his voice flat and professional like nothing had happened. Alice had no idea how to respond or even if she should mention what had occurred outside. Does he remember? Does he care? She swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. She took a seat across from him, her hands trembling as she placed them in her lap. Her mind raced, but nothing could prepare her for the words that would come next. David Scott didn't just remember, he was the one offering her the job. Alice sat stiffly in the chair, trying to hide her nerves as David Scott flipped through her resume. Her heart was still racing from the disaster outside, but now there was something much bigger on the line. This interview was no longer just about a job, it was about survival. She had to get this position. She had no choice. David sat across from her, his sharp gray eyes glancing over her resume. His every move exuded power and control. His suit was perfectly tailored, his posture immaculate, and his expression unreadable. The man seemed to have an aura of authority that was impossible to ignore. Alice, on the other hand, felt like a small, nervous child in front of a giant. "So," David finally spoke, his voice as cool and composed as ever. "You've worked in a few different roles, mostly in short-term positions. You've been out of work for a while now, and it looks like you've had some trouble paying bills. An eviction notice, if I'm not mistaken." Alice's face turned pale. Her worst fear had come true. David Scott had done his homework. He knew everything about her financial struggles, her past mistakes. It was all laid out on a piece of paper in front of him. She could feel her stomach tighten as the weight of her situation crushed her. I'm sorry you had to see that," Alice stammered, her voice barely a whisper, "but I'm trying to make things right. I've been working hard to pay everything off. This job would be a fresh start." David didn't seem fazed. He simply nodded, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk as if he were processing something in his mind. "I can see that," he said, still not offering her any expression of sympathy. "But why do you think you should be my secretary? What makes you different from all the others?" Alice took a deep breath. This was it. She needed to make him believe in her, despite the mess she had made in her life. She straightened her posture, willing herself to speak with confidence. "I'm organized, efficient, and I work well under pressure," Alice replied, forcing the words out with a calmness she didn't feel. She felt her hands trembling in her lap, but she tried to ignore it. "I'm proactive. I get things done without being asked, and I'm good at anticipating needs before they arise." David raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. He glanced down at the stain on his shirt, the very same stain she had caused just moments before. Alice could feel her face flush with embarrassment. "I think you've proven how well you work under pressure," David remarked dryly, his lips curling into a slight smirk. Alice's heart sank. He was right, she had ruined the first impression. The coffee incident was going to haunt her for the rest of this interview. She quickly tried to recover, her mind racing for an excuse, but nothing seemed to come out right. I don't usually spill coffee on my bosses, she added awkwardly, trying to make light of the situation. David didn't even crack a smile. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, still observing her with those piercing eyes. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing second. "You're here for the secretary position," David continued after a long pause. "But I'm not sure you understand what that entails. This job isn't just about answering phones or booking meetings. It's about managing everything I don't want to do." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "It's about making sure my life runs as smoothly as my business." Alice nodded, trying to process his words. It was clear that this wasn't just any secretary position, but she wasn't about to back down. She had no choice but to prove herself. "I can handle that," Alice said, her voice a little steadier now. "I've always been good at taking care of things behind the scenes. I know how to prioritize, how to juggle multiple tasks, and I'm not afraid of pressure. I've dealt with worse." David's eyes flickered with something resembling interest. For the first time, he set the resume down and leaned forward slightly. His demeanor shifted ever so slightly, but Alice wasn't sure if it was a positive change or just another test. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Martins," David said, his tone becoming more serious. "I don't take kindly to mistakes, especially not from someone I'm paying. This isn't a place for second chances, but if you're willing to prove yourself, I'll give you the opportunity." Alice swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She had never been given a second chance before, not in the way David was offering. It felt like an ultimatum, but it also felt like her only shot. "I'll prove it to you," Alice said, her voice firm, determined. "I'm ready, I can do this." David studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on her as if he were trying to decide something. For a brief second, Alice wondered if she was about to be dismissed. But then, to her surprise, he nodded. "All right," David said, his voice a little softer now. "We'll see how well you handle the job. You'll start immediately. Your first task is to organize my schedule for the week, prioritize the meetings, handle the emails, and prepare everything for tomorrow's board meeting. Can you do that?" "Yes," Alice replied without hesitation, her heart racing. This was it. This was her chance to prove herself, to show David that she was more than just her past mistakes. She couldn't afford to fail. "Good," David said, standing up and extending his hand. "I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Martins. I expect you to be prepared." Alice shook his hand, a mixture of excitement and dread washing over her. She had no idea what she was about to get into, but one thing was certain: she couldn't let him down. Not now. Not after everything that had led to this moment. As Alice left the conference room, she felt a surge of adrenaline. She had the job, but now she had to prove to David and to herself that she was capable of handling the pressure. This wasn't just about organizing his schedule or sending emails. It was about surviving in a world where everything seemed to be out of her control, where one mistake could cost her everything. The door to the office closed behind her, and Alice took a deep breath. She was in, and now she would have to fight to stay there. Alice spent the rest of the day in a daze. As soon as she left Scott Enterprises, her mind raced with a million thoughts, some conflicting, some focused, but all swirling together in a storm of uncertainty. She had a job finally, but nothing felt settled. David Scott had given her a second chance, yes, but was it truly a chance? Or was it just another opportunity for her to fail? She still couldn't shake the memory of the coffee disaster, the first impression, the humiliation that had left her feeling small and insignificant. Was that who she was? A woman who could only make a mess of things. The feeling of panic began to bubble up again. "I can't mess this up," but there was no time for self-doubt. Her mind snapped back to the present when she glanced at her phone. A text from her sister Lena popped up. "Mom's condition has worsened. Doctor says we need to make a decision soon." Alice felt a tight knot form in her chest. Her mother had been sick for months, but the situation was now critical. She had been holding it together until this moment, but the weight of her responsibilities was starting to crush her. The money she had saved was barely enough to pay her rent, let alone cover the cost of the treatments her mother needed. How could she continue to juggle it all? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. "David Scott, please come to my office at 5 p.m. Alice frowned. She didn't know what this could be about, but she knew she couldn't ignore it, not when her future at Scott Enterprises hung in the balance. She quickly replied, "I'll be there." Later that afternoon, Alice walked back into the Scott Enterprises building. Her nerves were on edge. She tried to steady herself, taking slow, deep breaths. It's just another meeting, just another opportunity to prove yourself. But something in her gut told her this meeting was different. The elevator ride to David's office felt like it took forever. When the doors opened, Alice stepped out into the sleek, minimalist hallway that led to his office. She tried to keep her composure, but her mind kept drifting back to her mother's condition. She needed this job, she needed the money, and David Scott, despite his cold demeanor and his arrogance, was her only way out. She knocked on the door to David's office. A calm, deep voice responded, "Enter." David sat behind his desk as usual, looking every bit the CEO he was. His suit was impeccable, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes sharp as always. He didn't smile when Alice entered, but he gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit down." Alice sat, trying to look confident, but inside she was a bundle of nerves. She could feel the weight of the silence between them. "Miss Martins," David began, not looking up from the file in his hands. "I've been reviewing your work so far. Your performance has been adequate." He paused, still flipping through papers. "However, there's something I'd like to discuss with you, something that will affect both of us." Alice's breath caught in her throat, her heart rate quickened and her palms became clammy. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. David finally looked up at her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "I'm offering you an opportunity," he said slowly. "An unusual one, but it could solve both of our problems." Alice stared at him, confused. "I don't understand." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You see, Miss Martins, I have certain needs, and unfortunately, my public image and personal life are too intertwined. I need someone to play a role that involves more than just being a secretary. I need a wife." Alice blinked, certain she had misheard him. "A wife," she repeated, incredulous. "Yes," David said, his voice steady. "A fake wife, a marriage of convenience, if you will. I need someone to accompany me to high-profile events, attend meetings with me, and pose as my spouse for the public eye. In exchange, I'll take care of your financial troubles. I'll pay off your debts, your mother's medical bills, and ensure your sister has everything she needs." Alice's head was spinning. Her mind screamed no, but her heart hesitated. This wasn't the kind of opportunity she had imagined, but it was an opportunity nonetheless. David continued, "I'm offering you this position, Miss Martins, because I believe you're capable. You're organized, you're efficient, and you understand the pressures of needing to succeed. This could work in both our favors." Alice's thoughts raced. She needed to think clearly. This was insane, right? A fake marriage. But the words David had said about paying off her debts and taking care of her mother echoed in her mind. It was more than she could have dreamed of, and yet this arrangement felt wrong on so many levels. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice small. "Why choose me?" David's expression softened for the briefest moment. "Because I know you're in a situation that's difficult to escape. And because you're the only one who can handle this without asking too many questions. You understand pressure. You understand sacrifice." Alice sat back, absorbing his words. She could feel her resistance starting to crumble. It wasn't just the money. It was the fact that David Scott was offering her a lifeline. A chance to escape her financial nightmare, to give her family a chance at stability. But was it worth the price of her dignity? A fake marriage. Pretending to love someone, David's eyes remained on her, waiting for her answer. He knew this was a big decision, but Alice could tell he was confident she would take the offer. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Her life had been defined by struggle, by scraping together what little she could and surviving day by day. She had never been given an easy way out until now. The fear of making the wrong choice was overwhelming, but deep down, she knew that this was the only chance she had to get her life on track. "All right," Alice said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'll do it. I'll be your fake wife." David's expression didn't change, but there was a slight shift in his posture as the weight had been lifted. "Good," he said, standing up. "We'll begin immediately. You'll need to attend a dinner with some of our top executives tomorrow evening. I'll have my assistant send you the details for your attire." Alice nodded, still processing everything. "And what about the public part of this? The part where we're pretending to be in love?" David paused, as if considering her question. "We'll take it step by step. Just remember, this is about the image. The public sees what we want them to see. When it's just the two of us, we'll keep it professional, nothing more." Alice's stomach tightened, nothing more. But somehow, despite her reservations, the offer felt like it was too good to pass up. That evening, Alice walked out of the building, still feeling the weight of the decision she had just made. A fake marriage. It sounded ridiculous, but it was also a lifeline. She couldn't let the fear of what might happen stop her from doing what she had to do. As she made her way to her apartment, her phone buzzed with another message from her sister. Mom's condition is deteriorating. We need to make decisions about her care. Alice stared at the message, the pressure of her choices mounting. But this contract with David Scott, as insane as it sounded, might be the only way to truly make a difference in her life and her family's. The days following Alice's agreement to the fake marriage offer felt like a blur. The chaos in her mind settled into a tense anticipation as she prepared for the role she never imagined she would have to play. The offer from David Scott seemed unreal. So much money, so many promises. But the deeper she went into this arrangement, the more she realized just how complicated it would be. She was going to pretend to be in love with a man who had the power to change her life, but whose emotional coldness made her question whether she could ever truly connect with him. As the sun dipped below the skyline of the city, Alice found herself standing in front of her mirror, adjusting the dress that David's assistant had arranged for her. It was simple yet elegant, fitting her figure perfectly. But as she stared at her reflection, she didn't see the woman who had walked into Scott Enterprises a few days ago. The desperate, struggling Alice seemed to be gone, replaced by someone more polished, more prepared. But was she ready? Her thoughts wandered back to the day she had met David, the cold, commanding CEO who hadn't given her a second glance, except to criticize her coffee mishap. That brief encounter had been a disaster, but now, here she was, preparing to stand by his side at a dinner for high-profile executives. David had given her a few instructions over the phone earlier that day. Keep it professional. Play the role and don't overstep. His words were simple, detached. There was no warmth in them, no hint of a partnership. Alice had understood it. This was a business arrangement. There would be no affection, no love between them. Just the image of a perfect, successful couple for the world to see. And yet, there was something in her chest that fluttered every time she thought about David. Despite his cold exterior, there was a complexity about him that Alice couldn't ignore. He was more than just a businessman. There was a depth to him, a vulnerability she had caught glimpses of during their brief exchanges. But those moments had been fleeting, like shadows passing in the night. The real David remained hidden behind the walls he had built around himself. The dinner at the high-end restaurant was everything Alice had expected. It was lavish, filled with the city's wealthiest and most influential people. Alice felt the weight of her new life pressing in on her as she stepped into the room with David by her side. She could feel eyes turning to them, watching their every move, judging their every gesture. They were the perfect couple, a CEO and his beautiful, elegant fiancée. The image was flawless. David walked with a quiet confidence, his posture impeccable. Alice walked beside him, her heels clicking on the marble floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the heat of the room, the expectations of the people around her. She was just one more cog in the wheel of the corporate world, another accessory on David's arm. But when he turned to her and gave a slight smile, just the faintest hint of a smile, it made her heart skip a beat. Was it a real smile, or just part of the act? As they approached the table where the other executives were seated, David pulled out her chair for her, a small, almost polite gesture. Alice glanced at him quickly, unsure of what she was supposed to do. Should she smile? Should she act more affectionate? She quickly realized that David Scott had made it clear this was not about emotions. This was about keeping up appearances. They sat down and the evening began. The conversation flowed around them as the executives discussed business strategies, mergers, and potential deals. Alice, doing her best to follow along, smiled and nodded when appropriate. It was clear she was out of her depth. She didn't belong in this world. She was just pretending to fit in. David, on the other hand, was at ease. His presence commanded the room. He spoke with authority, his every word measured and calculated. Alice could feel his power radiating from him, but she also noticed how distant he seemed from the people around him. He wasn't engaging with anyone in any meaningful way. His interactions were all business, polished, efficient, and emotionally detached. She couldn't help but wonder if that was how he viewed her. Another business transaction. Another asset to be used in his public image. But as the night wore on, she started to notice glasses echoed in her ears. "To new beginnings," David said, raising his glass. The words were simple, but there was something in his voice that made Alice pause. She wasn't sure if it was genuine or just part of the show, but she couldn't deny that she felt the weight of those words. "To new beginnings," she repeated, clinking her glass against his, even though she wasn't sure what exactly they were beginning. A fake marriage, a partnership of convenience. The evening wore on, but Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. David was acting distant, as expected, but there were moments, small moments, where his walls seemed to crack just a little. His gaze softened when he looked at her, and for the briefest of seconds, Alice saw something beyond the cold CEO, a man who was unsure, perhaps even vulnerable. She felt a strange sense of compassion for him, something she hadn't expected. But at the same time, she felt frustrated. What was this? This back and forth between him and her? One moment, he was the cold, distant businessman, and the next, he was showing a hint of humanity. That evening, as they left the restaurant, Alice couldn't help but notice the way David seemed to let his guard down. As they stepped into the cool night air, he casually placed his hand on her back, guiding her toward the car. The gesture was subtle but intimate, and Alice couldn't decide whether it was a sign of warmth or just another calculated move in his plan. They arrived at the luxurious penthouse apartment that David called home, and as they stepped out of the car, Alice felt the weight of their charade bearing down on her. This is it, she thought. This is the life I've agreed to. David led her up to his apartment, and as they stepped inside, Alice felt the tension in the air. The apartment was cold, minimalist, and stunning. Everything about it screamed wealth and success, but it also felt impersonal, like a place that was built for show, not for living. "I'll be in my study," David said, his voice breaking the silence. "You can make yourself comfortable in the guest room." Alice nodded, her thoughts still swirling. She had just spent the evening pretending to be someone she wasn't. She had played the role of the doting fiancé, smiling for the cameras and for the people in the room, but deep down, she knew it was all just a game. As she stood in the empty apartment, she wondered what would happen next. Would this fake marriage eventually blur into something real? Would she ever be able to trust David? And more importantly, would she ever allow herself to let go of her fears and doubts and truly embrace this strange new life? As the door to the study closed behind David, Alice stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline. The lights below twinkled like stars, each one a reminder that her life had just taken a sharp turn. But where would it lead? The next few days blurred together as Alice adjusted to the whirlwind that had become her new life. The charade of being David Scott's fiancé, pretending to be in love, was draining. Every time they attended an event together, every time they posed for photos, she felt like she was playing a part in a movie, and the lines between reality and fiction blurred further with each passing hour. But no one seemed to notice. No one seemed to see through their perfect facade, except Alice. The first few days after the dinner had been a strange mixture of disconnection and unease. David, as always, maintained a cold, professional distance between them. His words were calculated, his gestures deliberate. He would give her the occasional nod of approval or direct her on tasks that needed doing, most of it focused on his public image. Alice had quickly learned to anticipate his needs, organizing his schedule, preparing briefings for meetings, and attending events with him, always at his side, never out of place. She had thought that maybe, just maybe, after the wedding proposal, something would shift. Maybe she would feel like she truly belonged in David's world, but that wasn't happening. She was still just a stranger in his life, someone he had hired to play a role she was growing less sure she could continue. Each morning, she woke up in the guest room of his penthouse, the silence of the empty apartment pressing in on her. The absence of warmth, the lack of personal connection, had begun to suffocate her. The apartment was stunning, luxurious and sleek, but it felt cold, distant. It was as if everything in it was meticulously curated for someone who had no intention of truly living in it. Despite the wealth and the polished exterior, David seemed emotionally distant, unreachable. He never asked her how she was doing, never seemed concerned about how she felt. The dinners they attended were the same. He kept his conversations with her formal, businesslike, and Alice had begun to wonder if he had ever truly cared about her, or if this was just another contract for him. And yet, there were moments. In rare instances, when he thought she wasn't looking, Alice caught a fleeting glance in David's eyes, something soft, something almost vulnerable. gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to make Alice question everything. Was it possible that, beneath the cold exterior, there was more to David than the calculating businessman everyone saw? But no matter how hard she tried to understand him, she couldn't ignore the sense of isolation she felt whenever she was around him. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The walls he built around himself were high, impenetrable, and Alice didn't know how to break through them. The tension between them was palpable. Whenever their eyes met, a spark of something more seemed to flicker, but it was quickly smothered by the harsh reality of their arrangement. She was just a placeholder, a woman to stand by his side when needed, to play the role of fiancée and wife. But how long could she pretend? That evening, as Alice sat in her usual seat beside David at yet another formal dinner, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The dinner was filled with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses, but Alice felt disconnected from it all. She watched David across the table as he effortlessly charmed the guests around him. His words were smooth, his smile perfect, but Alice could see the tension in his posture, the way he kept his distance from everyone. It was like watching a man trapped in his own cage. Her thoughts were interrupted when David suddenly turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Martins, could you pass the wine?" he asked, his voice as crisp as ever. Alice blinked in surprise. Of course. She picked up the bottle and poured the wine into his glass, suddenly feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She felt self-conscious, the way she always did around him. There was always this sense that she was under scrutiny, that she had to perform perfectly. But no matter how much she tried, she could never be sure of what David truly thought of her. When the dinner ended and the guests began to filter out, David remained as distant as ever. Alice, her nerves already on edge, followed him silently as he led her out to the car. It was strange, but she felt like she was playing a part in someone else's life, someone else's world. A world she didn't truly belong to. As they sat in the back of the car, the tension between them was thick. Alice's mind raced as she stared out of the window, her thoughts consumed by everything she hadn't been able to voice. The loneliness, the isolation, the weight of the fake engagement. She was tired of pretending, tired of living a life that wasn't her own. David, sitting beside her, didn't speak. His gaze was fixed out of the window, lost in thought. Alice wondered, for the millionth time, what was going on inside his head. Did he ever feel anything? Was he capable of feeling anything at all? The car pulled up in front of the penthouse, and David stepped out first, walking towards the entrance without a word. Alice followed, her footsteps hesitant. She didn't want to go back to the empty apartment, the silence that followed them everywhere they went. Once inside, David removed his jacket and walked toward the study. Alice stood in the living room, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She could feel the tension in the air, the way everything between them seemed to be strained and fragile. "Alice," David's voice broke the silence. She turned to face him, but his gaze was cold, distant once again. "I need to talk to you." Her heart skipped a beat. Was this it? The moment where he would finally admit that the whole thing was a mistake, that the fake engagement had been nothing more than a means to an end. "What is it?" she asked, trying to sound calm, though her voice betrayed her anxiety. David stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "I think we need to make this more convincing. The board members are starting to ask questions about our relationship." Alice felt a knot form in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we can't keep pretending forever. If this is going to work, we need to act like a real couple, publicly at least." Alice's mind raced. A real couple. She was already living in a world of pretense. How much further would they go with this charade? David continued, his voice steady but firm. "Tomorrow, we have a dinner with a few more investors. I need you to be convincing. The board is starting to see through our act, and I'm not about to let that ruin everything." Alice took a deep breath. The weight of David's words settled heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know how to handle this. She wasn't an actress. She wasn't trained to deceive people, to play a role that wasn't hers. But if she wanted to keep her job and her life on track, she had no choice. David stepped back, his expression unchanged. "We'll take it step by step, but I need you to keep your emotions in check. Don't let anything slip." Alice nodded, trying to hold it together. She wasn't sure she could do this, but the truth was, she had no other choice. The next day, Alice stood in front of the mirror again, preparing herself for another evening of playing a part. The dress was new, the makeup was perfect, and the smile she forced onto her face was as convincing as she could make it. But inside, Alice felt like a Alice couldn't help but feel the weight of David's expectations bearing down on her. She followed him, smiling, nodding, and pretending to be the woman he needed her to be. But as the evening went on, Alice began to feel something she hadn't expected: guilt. It wasn't just the act that bothered her. It was the fact that the lines between what was real and what was fake were beginning to blur. She glanced at David, who was deep in conversation with an investor, and realized that despite their cold interactions, there was a small part of her that had started to care. Maybe she wasn't just pretending anymore, and that terrified her. The days following Alice's last dinner with David had left her feeling both defeated and conflicted. The demands of her new role began to wear on her, and her life, once filled with small, simple joys, now revolved around pretense and performance. She had grown accustomed to the sharp glances from people who didn't know her, to the forced smiles, and to the coldness of David's calculated gestures. But in all of this, she couldn't ignore the small glimmer of something deeper that seemed to flicker whenever their eyes met in private moments. Something neither of them were willing to acknowledge, not fully. That evening, as she stood in front of the mirror adjusting the dress David had chosen for her, Alice wondered how she had ended up here. It wasn't that she had not known the rules of the game. David had made it clear from the start: play the role, pretend. And yet, the more she played the role of David's fiancé, the more she felt like she was losing herself. Her phone buzzed in the background, and Alice snapped out of her thoughts. A message from Leon popped up, Mom's still the same. She needs the procedure, Alice. Alice sighed. This was the part of her life she could never escape, the part of her life that didn't care about David Scott's wealth or influence. It was the reality of her responsibilities that gnawed at her every day. There was no pretending when it came to her family. She glanced at her reflection one last time and walked out of the room. Tonight was another one of those high-profile dinners, and she would have to play the part once more. As she made her way downstairs to meet David, her heart felt heavier than usual. The car ride to the event was quiet. The only sounds in the backseat were the faint hum of the car's engine and the soft clicking of David's phone. Alice sat with her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts spinning. She kept glancing at David, who remained engrossed in his work, his eyes never leaving the screen in front of him. For a moment, she felt like an invisible accessory, nothing more than a decoration for his arm. They arrived at the venue, a grand ballroom filled with sparkling chandeliers and elegantly dressed guests. Alice felt the familiar rush of unease, the pressure to perform. The role she was playing had become more demanding than ever, and the weight of the lies began to feel suffocating. She had to smile. She had to look the part, but beneath the surface, there was a storm brewing. David led her through the crowd of people, his presence commanding attention. He was smooth, confident, the CEO everyone respected, but Alice could sense the distance between them. His hand rested lightly on her back, a professional touch rather than an affectionate one. As they sat at the table with the other guests, Alice tried to engage in conversation, but every time she spoke, it felt forced, like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. David, on the other hand, spoke with ease, his words precise and calculated. He charmed everyone around him with his charisma, but to Alice, it felt like a performance, a role he played so effortlessly. Through it all, she couldn't help but feel like an outsider in his world. She was part of the game, but not really with him. This is just a transaction, she reminded herself, nothing more. As the dinner progressed, Alice couldn't help but notice the way the other women at the table looked at her, curious, calculating. Some were jealous, others intrigued. They all knew what this arrangement was, even if they didn't know the details. Alice wasn't just a woman by David's side, she was a spectacle, a part of his image, and that's all she would ever be. David's cold demeanor, which had become second nature to him, grew more evident as the night wore on. Every interaction, every conversation was part of the act. He never once glanced at Alice unless it was for show. There was no warmth, no connection between them, only the veneer of a perfect couple. The night dragged on, and Alice found herself more and more detached from everything around her. She smiled when necessary, nodded when appropriate, and answered questions when asked. But inside, she was exhausted. She was playing a part she never asked for, and the lines between the role and reality were starting to blur. When the event finally ended, David walked with Alice to the car. The cold air nipped at her skin, but it wasn't the chill of the night that made her shiver. It was the emptiness of it all, the loneliness she felt even when she was surrounded by people. David's presence next to into the car, and the drive home was silent once again. Alice stared out of the window, her thoughts consumed with the mess her life had become. How did I get here? When they arrived back at the penthouse, David got out of the car first, walking briskly towards the entrance. Alice followed, her footsteps heavy. As soon as they entered, David removed his jacket and set it on the armchair. He turned to her with a look of indifference. "I have a few things to take care of in the office," he said flatly. "You're free to do whatever you want tonight." Alice nodded, but she didn't feel free. She felt like a puppet. She had agreed to the arrangement for the financial security it offered, but now she was starting to wonder if it was worth it. She had been living in David's world for days now, and the longer she did, the more she felt like she was losing herself. She wasn't Alice Martin's anymore. She was just a piece of David Scott's image. She walked to her room, not bothering to change out of her dress. She lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The silence was deafening. Her mind raced with questions, but no answers came. The part of her that had been so eager to escape her financial troubles now felt trapped in an emotional cage. As she stared at the ceiling, the phone buzzed again. Another message from Lena. "Alice, I don't know how much longer we can wait. Mom needs the surgery. We don't have the money for it." Tears welled up in Alice's eyes as she read the message. She knew Lena was right. Her mother's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Alice had no way of paying for the surgery. "I'm so close," Alice thought. "This deal with David could fix everything. But at what cost?" Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from David himself. "Alice, come to my office. We need to discuss our next steps." Alice sat up in bed, wiping her eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "This is just another meeting," she told herself. "I can handle it." She walked to the office, her mind still a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. When she entered, David was sitting at the desk, his face expressionless as always. But as soon as he saw her, he stood up, his gaze softer than usual. "We need to take this to the next level, Alice," he said, his voice quieter than before. "You've been doing well, but there's more at stake now. The board is watching us more closely. We need to look like real people. That means more than just appearances." Alice's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, not sure if she wanted to hear the answer. David walked over to her, his expression unreadable. "We need to make it real. We need to convince them. The public wants to see a connection between us, a genuine connection. And if we're going to keep this up, we'll have to make it believable." Alice stared at him, her pulse racing. A real connection? Was he asking her to actually feel something for him? Or was this just another part of the performance? David reached out and gently touched her arm, his hand warm against her skin. "I know this is complicated," he said, his voice softening, "but I need you to trust me." Alice's mind was a storm of emotions. She wanted to pull away, to push him out of her life. But at the same time, there was a part of her that did trust him. A part of her that wanted to believe there was something real beneath his cold exterior. But how could she trust someone who had made it clear that everything was a business transaction? The days following David's subtle invitation to make their relationship more real were like walking on a tightrope. Alice felt herself teetering between the person she had been before meeting David, someone who fought for survival, and the new role she was expected to play as his fiancé. The lines between the two were becoming dangerously blurred. who she truly was. It was just another costume to wear for the night. She had never cared about appearances before. Growing up, she learned that survival was about being real, about keeping your head down, doing the work, and never asking for more than you deserved. But here, in this world of glitz and glamour, appearances were everything. And for the first time in her life, Alice wasn't sure she knew how to play the game. When she walked into the penthouse living room later that night, David stood waiting for her. He was dressed in a sleek black tuxedo, his hair meticulously styled, and his expression as neutral as ever. He didn't look at her in the way she expected. There was no softening in his eyes, no warmth in his demeanor. He was a man of business, always focused, always calculating. "Ready?" he asked, his tone flat. Alice nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Ready," she lied, her voice barely audible. The gala was everything Alice had expected: opulent, filled with powerful people, and surrounded by flashing cameras. The air was thick with perfume and champagne, and everywhere she looked, there were perfectly polished smiles and carefully constructed conversations. It wasn't her world. She didn't belong here. David, on the other hand, moved through the crowd effortlessly. His confidence was intoxicating to the people around him. He was the CEO, the man everyone respected. But to Alice, he seemed like a man who had mastered the art of wearing a mask. They entered the main hall together, arms linked, walking past the crowd of people who immediately recognized them as the couple of the hour. Cameras flashed and reporters crowded around, eager to capture every moment. Alice kept her gaze straight ahead, her posture perfect, a smile plastered on her face. "This is my role," she reminded herself. "This is just another performance." But as they reached their table and settled in for the evening, something shifted. David turned to her briefly, his gaze softer than usual. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he was actually paying attention to her. His eyes lingered just a little too long, his lips curled up in the corners, the briefest smile touching his face. Alice's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a ripple through her carefully constructed arm. Had he felt something, or was it just another part of the act? The dinner began, and David resumed his role as the charismatic CEO, charming everyone at the table with his easy laughter and sharp wit. Alice sat silently beside him, nodding when he needed to speak with him. But every time their eyes met, the tension grew. She could feel him watching her, gauging her reactions, analyzing every move she made. For the first time in weeks, Alice felt something shift. She wasn't sure what it was. Could it be real? The evening passed in haze, the conversations blended into one long string of meaningless pleasantries. But as they left the gala and headed back to the penthouse, Alice felt different. Something had changed between them, even if she couldn't quite place it. When they arrived home, the penthouse was as quiet and still as always. Alice stepped inside, the weight of the night's events pressing down on her. David, still in his tuxedo, walked to the bar and poured himself a drink. He turned to her, his expression unbelievable. "I'm not sure how long we can keep this up, Alice." Alice's heart lurched in her chest. "Not this again." She swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. David set his glass down, walking over to her. The charade, the fake marriage, the image we're trying to sell. People are starting to ask questions, and the truth is, I'm not sure how much longer I can pretend either. Alice felt a chill run through her. She had always known this day would come, but hearing it from him felt different. It wasn't just about her anymore. David had begun to doubt their arrangement. David sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what I'm doing, Alice. I've spent my life building an empire, creating this image of perfection. But it feels empty now. Everything feels empty." Alice stared at him, her heart softening, so he wasn't just playing the role after all. She stepped forward slowly, cautiously. "David, maybe we're both caught in this. Maybe it's not just the world around us. Maybe it's us too." David looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he spoke. "I don't know if I'm ready for something real, Alice, but I'm not sure I want to let go of this, of you either." His words hung in the air, and Alice felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the moment when everything would change. The moment when the walls between them could finally come down, and she was strong enough to allow it. The next day, David called her into his office. When Alice arrived, she was met with an unexpected sight. something. He looked up at her, his gray eyes no longer as distant. I can't keep pretending that this is just a business arrangement. It's not that simple, and I think you know that too. Alice felt her breath hitch. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was he really saying what she thought he was saying? I don't know what this means yet, David continued, but I know I don't want to lose you, Alice. I can't keep living like this. Alice stood there speechless. This was the moment when everything could change. She had spent so much time wondering what it would be like to be loved by someone like David, and now it seemed like he was finally willing to open up. But the question was she ready to let him? The next few weeks passed in a blur for Alice. It was as if life had moved into a new chapter, one filled with unexpected twists, moments of doubt, and lingering questions about who she was becoming. David's words, spoken so matter-of-factly in his office, echoed in her mind. I can't keep pretending I don't want to lose you. The realization that David Scott, the powerful, distant CEO, had finally acknowledged that the charade they'd been living wasn't sustainable sent a mix of emotions through Alice. On one hand, she was relieved. She had feared that David would continue to treat her like an accessory, like a business asset, for much longer. But on the other hand, his admission made her feel exposed, vulnerable. What did it mean for them? What would happen next? Alice had spent so much of her life in survival mode, barely able to keep her head above water. This arrangement, this fake engagement, had been the best opportunity she'd had in years. The idea that David was questioning it and that their roles might actually become real scared her in ways she hadn't expected. She found herself pacing the penthouse late one night, her thoughts racing. David hadn't brought up the issue again since that conversation in his office. He continued to treat her with the same professional distance he always had, only now it was laced with an unspoken tension. There were moments, brief moments, when he would look at her differently, as if there were more to what they shared than just a business transaction. But those moments never lasted long enough for Alice to grasp them. It was as if David were testing the waters of something he wasn't ready to fully embrace yet. The pressure of pretending was beginning to wear Alice down. The events, the dinners, the board meetings, they were all starting to feel like a show. She was always at David's side, the perfect fiancé, always by his side at his bidding, always watching him from afar. It was a delicate balance, one that was becoming more difficult to maintain. Alice had tried to separate her feelings from the situation, but it wasn't working. Every time David touched her hand or gave her a faint smile, her heart skipped a beat. Was this all just part of the act, or was there something more beneath the surface? The only time Alice felt some semblance of peace was when she was away from the public eye, at the penthouse alone. But even then, the silence in the apartment felt suffocating. Alice spent her nights in the guest room, unable to sleep, her thoughts endlessly circling around the reality of her life now. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her mind racing with questions. One morning, as Alice prepared for another busy day at Scott Enterprises, she received a phone call from her sister Lena. "Hey, Alice," Lena's voice was shaky. "I got some news from the doctor." Alice's heart dropped into her stomach. "What happened? Is Mom okay?" Lena paused before answering. "The doctor said that Mom's condition is really serious. The surgery needs to happen soon. I know we're already behind on the bills, but if we don't do this, we might lose her." Alice felt her world crash down around her. The thought of losing her mother had always been the worst fear, but it had never felt this close before. She knew what needed to be done, but the weight of the decision was almost unbearable. "Lena," Alice said, her voice breaking, "I don't have the money. I don't know what to do." "You don't have to figure it all out by yourself," Lena replied. "Just don't forget that we're a family. We'll get through this together." Alice closed her eyes, fighting back the tears. She had made this deal with David. She had agreed to the fake marriage for the money, for the security it promised. But could she really live with herself if she continued this farce, knowing that her mother's life depended on it? How much of her own integrity was she willing to sacrifice? Her phone buzzed again, a message from David. "I need you at the office in 1 hour. We're meeting with investors. The timing couldn't have been worse." Alice knew that she had to go, but her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. What if this is the last chance to save my mother? She took a deep breath, wiped the tears from her eyes, and began preparing for the meeting. There was no more time to question her choices. She had to face the reality of the decision she had made. When Alice entered the Scott Enterprises office later that morning, she was greeted by the usual crowd of executives. David was at the head of the conference table, as always, his expression professional and cold. He didn't acknowledge her with the warmth she had hoped for, but instead he gave her a small nod, as if reminding her of the role she was supposed to play. The meeting was long and full of jargon that Alice didn't fully understand, but she smiled and nodded when needed, keeping up appearances. It wasn't until later that afternoon when David pulled her aside that things began to shift. "Alice," he said quietly, his voice tense. "We need to talk. I don't think you fully understand the stakes of what we're doing here. The board members are getting curious. They want proof that we're serious about this engagement, and we need to give them more than just appearances." Alice felt her heart race. "What do you mean?" David looked around, ensuring no one else could hear their conversation. "We need to start acting more like a real couple. The board won't buy it otherwise." Her stomach churned. This was it. The moment when the fake engagement would go from an arrangement to something much more complicated. "I don't think I'm ready for that," Alice said quietly. "This whole thing, it's becoming more than I expected. I'm not sure what this is anymore." David's expression softened, but only for a moment. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I know this isn't easy for you, but this is what we agreed on. You've already made the choice." Alice didn't answer immediately. What was she supposed to say to that? She had agreed to this deal, but now, with the weight of her family's struggles and her own emotional turmoil pressing down on her, the agreement felt like a ball and chain. Was she really willing to sacrifice everything for the money? Was she truly willing to sacrifice her dignity, her heart, for a contract that only kept her at arm's length from the man who was supposed to be her partner? The silence between them grew thick. Alice tried to think, but all she could hear was the rush of her heartbeat in her ears. "I need time," she said finally, the words coming out shakily. David didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand," he said softly. "But remember, Alice, we don't have all the time in the world. You know how this works." Alice nodded, but inside she was lost. Later that night, as Alice sat in the quiet of the penthouse, she felt a pang of loneliness deeper than anything she had experienced in years. It wasn't just the physical isolation, it was the emotional distance between her and David. The realization hit her hard. She wasn't just trapped in a contract, she was trapped in her own emotions. She stood up, walking over to the window. The lights of the city sparkled below, but they felt distant. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. It wasn't supposed to be this way. As she stood there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Nina. "Alice, we found a way to pay for Mom's surgery. We don't need to wait anymore." Alice felt a wave of relief flood over her. For the first time in days, she felt like the weight on her chest had been lifted. But even as she texted her sister back, confirming the news, a part of her knew that this was just the beginning. David had made her a promise, but now, with her family's future on the line, Alice couldn't help but wonder, could she trust him? The next day was quieter than usual. Alice found herself alone in the penthouse, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the city below. She had spent the night in turmoil, her thoughts a constant whirlwind. The relief she had felt after receiving Nina's message about her mother's surgery was real, but it was tainted by the uncertainty of what came next. What now? The entire arrangement with David was beginning to feel like a game, one where she had no control. She had entered into this fake engagement as a means to an end, but now, everything was starting to feel like it was spiraling out of her grasp. The lines between the performance she had agreed to play and her real feelings were becoming more and more blurred. The deeper she fell into David's world, the more difficult it was to remember who she was without it. Alice had spent so much of her life trying to survive, to scrape by, and to put family first. The financial freedom David promised felt like the only solution to her years of struggle, but at what cost? She had made her choice, but was it the right one? She closed her eyes, trying to push away the doubts creeping into her mind. She needed clarity. She needed a moment of peace. That evening, after a long day at Scott Enterprises, Alice was on her way home when she received a text from David. "We need to meet at the office tonight. There are some things we need to discuss." Her stomach clenched. Again, the last conversation they had felt like a turning point, but now it seemed like David was pulling her back into the same pattern, one of false promises and emotional distance. Alice knew she couldn't keep running from the situation. She couldn't avoid the truth any longer. If she were going to continue with this arrangement, she needed to be more than just a pawn in David's game. She had to find her own voice, even if it meant confronting the things she had been avoiding. When she arrived at the office that evening, the building was quieter than usual. Most of the employees had gone home for the day, leaving only a few scattered figures working late. The lights in David's office were still on, a beacon in the otherwise empty hallway. Alice hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. David was sitting at his desk, flipping through papers. When he saw her, he set the documents down and stood up. His eyes softened just slightly, but his expression remained stoic, unreadable. "Come in, Alice," he said, his voice calm but with a certain edge. "I've been thinking about what we talked about the other day. I think it's time we make things more real for the both of us." Alice's heart skipped a beat. She was already on edge, but now the weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. Real? Was he asking for more than just a show of affection? Was he expecting her to feel something for him, something that wasn't part of their arrangement? David walked toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. "I think we've both been playing this game long enough. I've been trying to keep everything in control, but the truth is, I can't keep pretending. I can't keep pretending that we're not more than just a business arrangement." Alice opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind was racing. What did he mean? Was he saying that this fake engagement could turn into something more? David continued, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I know I've been cold, distant. I built this wall around myself, thinking I could keep everything under control. But you," he paused, running a hand through his hair, "you've made me question everything. I can't keep up this facade with you anymore." Alice blinked, feeling a mix of shock and confusion. She had expected the usual business talk, the cold professionalism that had defined their relationship up until now. But this was different. Was David finally showing vulnerability? "You don't have to do this," Alice said, her voice low. "You don't have to pretend with me. I'm just a part of your image, David. Nothing more, I understand that." David shook his head, a faint frustration creeping into his eyes. "No, Alice, that's the point. I've spent my entire life building this image, this empire. I've built walls to protect myself, but now I'm not sure who I am without those walls." Alice's heart ached. This was what she had been afraid of. David Scott, the man she had always seen as the unshakable CEO, was struggling. He was admitting that he didn't have all the answers, that the walls he had so carefully constructed were beginning to crumble. But what did this mean for her? "David," she began, her voice shaky. "I'm not sure I can be the person you want me to be. I can't just play the part of a perfect fiancé. I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not." David took a step closer, his gaze softening. "I don't want you to pretend, Alice. I just want you to be real with me. You've seen the truth about me. I'm not perfect. I'm not who I pretend to be, and I don't expect you to be either." For the first time, Alice saw a crack in his armor. This wasn't just about the contract anymore. This was about him. "I don't know if I'm ready to be real with you, David," Alice said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you. After everything, after all the lies." David's expression hardened for a moment, but then he sighed, as if the weight of the conversation had finally caught up with him. "I understand," he said quietly. "I know I've hurt you and I don't deserve your trust, but I need you to understand something. I don't want to keep living this way. I don't want to keep hiding." Alice met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability that had been buried for so long. But could she trust him? "I need time," Alice said, her voice breaking. "I need to figure out what I want. I can't keep living this lie." David nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting her response. "Take all the time you need, but just know this, Alice, I don't want to lose you. I want to try to make this real, whatever it takes." For a moment, Alice felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. This was it, the moment when everything could change. She had spent so much time in fear, so much time pretending, that she had lost sight of what mattered most. Was it too late to start over? She stood there, lost in thought, as David's words lingered in the air between them. Later that night, Alice sat alone in her room, her mind still racing. She had spent so much of her life in survival mode, focused on keeping things together, keeping her family afloat. She had never allowed herself to truly feel, to truly trust. But now, as she sat in the quiet of the penthouse, she realized that something had changed between her and David. Whether it was real or just another part of the act, she didn't know. but what if it could be real? What if she could start over, let go of the walls she had built around her heart, and allow herself to be vulnerable? The thought terrified her. But as she closed her eyes, she realized that perhaps, for the first time in her life, she was ready to take the risk. The next morning, Alice awoke to the sound of city traffic below her window. The usual hum of the penthouse felt different today. It was quieter, more still, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Alice stretched, her muscles sore from a restless night filled with uneasy dreams. She had barely slept, her mind a battlefield of emotions. What was she supposed to do? What choice was there left to make? The conversation with David last night had shaken her to her core. For the first time, he had let down his walls, allowing her to see the man beneath the CEO. He had shown vulnerability, and that had made Alice question everything. She had always known David as the stoic, cold businessman, but now she saw someone who was more than just the sum of his public image. She saw someone who had been hiding, someone who had built an empire around himself to protect what was fragile inside. But was that enough for her to trust him? Could she trust him? Alice stood up from the bed, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. She had spent the past few months pretending, living in a world that wasn't hers for a man who had never truly let her in. But now, things had changed. The question was whether she could accept it, whether she could take the leap into something real, something beyond the contracts and the pretense. She dressed quickly and walked to the kitchen, needing something to ground her. As she made a cup of coffee, she noticed the silence in the apartment. David hadn't come home last night. It wasn't unusual, given his long work hours, but there was something different about it today, a sense of distance that felt permanent. She sipped her coffee slowly, her mind racing through the possibilities. Could they really make this work? Was there a future for them beyond the walls they had built around themselves? Alice knew that there was no easy answer. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that she was okay with living in David's world as a mere accessory to his life. But at the same time, she knew that she couldn't just walk away from the first sign of vulnerability he had shown. The day dragged on in the same monotonous rhythm. Alice worked through the piles of paperwork on her desk at Scott Enterprises, each signature, each form, feeling more and more like a weight around her shoulders. The office was quieter than usual. David hadn't shown up for the meeting scheduled that morning, nor had he responded to her messages. What was going on? By the time the evening came, Alice had grown tired of waiting. She couldn't sit in the penthouse any longer, consumed by unanswered questions. If David was serious about their relationship, why wasn't he here? Why wasn't he reaching out? Deciding she could no longer wait for him to come to her, Alice grabbed her coat and walked out of the office. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to let David control the situation any longer. The ride to Scott Tech's headquarters was short, but every second of it felt like an eternity. Alice's nerves were a tangle of uncertainty. What if he didn't want to see her? What if he had changed his mind? As she stepped out of the elevator and into David's office, she saw him standing by the large window staring out at the skyline. He didn't notice her at first, and for a moment, Alice simply stood there watching him. He looked different. David turned around as if sensing her presence. His eyes locked with hers, and there was something in them that made Alice's heart beat faster. But it wasn't the usual coldness. This time, there was an openness, a vulnerability that was almost too much to bear. "Alice," David said softly, his voice tinged with surprise. "I didn't expect you here." Alice stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. "I need to talk to you, David," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending." David's face tightened, and for a moment, Alice thought he might push her away. But then he took a deep breath and walked toward her, closing the space between them. "I know," he said quietly. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, and I know I've made this harder than it needs to be." Alice felt the sting of his words, but she knew they were true. She had been living a lie, playing a part she never asked for, in a world she didn't belong to. "I don't want to be part of your world anymore, David," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't want to be a part of this image you've created. I want something real. I want us to be real." David's eyes softened as he stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "I don't know if I can give you that," he admitted. "I don't know if I know how to be anything other than who I've always been." Alice swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had spent so long trying to be someone she wasn't, trying to live up to a version of herself she had created in her head. Could she really give all that up for something real, for something unknown? Could she trust David with her heart, knowing he might not be capable of doing the same? "I don't want you to change, David," Alice said, her voice breaking. "I just want us to stop pretending. I want to know who you really are, and I want you to know who I really am." David reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and firm. "You've already seen the worst of me," he said, his voice low, "but I'm trying. I'm trying to be more than the man I've been for so long. I'm trying to give you what you need, but I need you to meet me halfway." Alice closed her eyes, the tears threatening to spill over. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the truth, from her emotions. But now, standing here with David, she felt like she was finally facing everything that had been holding her back. The fear of being vulnerable, of trusting, of loving, everything that had kept her from opening her heart to him was suddenly gone. "I'm scared," Alice admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what it means to trust you. I'm scared of what it means to let someone in." David's thumb brushed over her hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Alice felt like she wasn't alone. "I know," he said gently, "but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, they stood in silence, just holding each other's gaze. It was as if the world had stopped spinning around them, and all that mattered was the connection they shared in that moment. Alice finally exhaled, a weight lifting from her chest. "I don't know what happens next," she said quietly, "but I'm ready to find out." David smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "Then let's take this one step at a time, together." And with that, something shifted between them. The walls they had both built around their hearts started to crumble, piece by piece. The facade of the fake engagement, the performance, the roles, they no longer mattered. What mattered now was the truth about who they were and who they could become together. As they stood there, holding each other's gaze, Alice knew that their journey had only just begun. But for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next with David by her side.